Good evening. Welcome to a new season of Ground Waves, hosted by Shari Zion Beth-El congregation in Montreal. My name is Rabbi Adina Lewittes, and together with my friend and Ground Waves co-founder, musician Dan Nadel, we'll be airing once a month between now and June for our unique weaving together of soaring music, deep Torah, and transformative conversation. We're gathering tonight from all over the United States and Canada. Tonight, I'm coming to you from Snowbird, Utah, where I've escaped to ski for a few days, land that was the ancestral and traditional home of the Fremont, Shoshone, and Ute people. It's hard to fathom how many changes the world and we have endured since we were last together on Ground Waves 8 months ago in June of 2021. We've been teased by moments of COVID relief, only to be bombarded by variants like Delta and Omicron. We have fought and are still fighting over vaccine mandates, mask requirements, boosters, revealing the threadbare fabric holding our democracies together and the sharpened edges of our relationships, personal and societal, scraping against pandemic fatigue, grief, and impatience. We've also been contending with what's been dubbed the Great Resignation, the trend sparked by the pandemic of people quitting their jobs either because time under lockdown gave them perspective on how unhappy they were at the office, or because COVID's scary confrontation with mortality woke people up to the urgency of following their dreams, or because so many other people leaving their jobs finally gave them the courage to do the same. It's been documented in just about every professional field, and just last week in the world of rabbis as well. But the story of the Great Resignation, as it's being told in newspapers and on social media, hasn't fully captured the angst and the confusion that often precede a decision to change course, whether it's about our work life or any other commitment we may have, our religious life, our family life, our social life, or our political life. Wrestling with whether to listen to our heads or our hearts, to our colleagues or our friends, to the past or to the future, we can feel pulled in a million different directions. Living as we do in a world of unprecedented choice, the challenge of balancing our yearning for change with our longing for stability, our yearning for freedom with our longing to belong, can be tough, even painful, sometimes comical. I, for one, feel like I've been navigating that precipice between defiance and devotion my whole life. In my younger days, I was a serious student and the class clown. I practiced my Judaism and questioned it with equal passion. At Camp Masad in the Laurentian Mountains, where I met the young Adam Stotland, beloved cantor of Shari Zion Beth-El, I was known as a Tullis-clad minyan leader by morning and a beach bum by afternoon. And if you asked my staff, a cigar-smoking whiskey drinker by night. Not much has changed. I became an early female rabbi in a patriarchal tradition. I'm a committed Jew and a passionate humanist, a rabbinic entrepreneur who's built my own communities while always yearning to sit at the table with my colleagues. See, a key chapter in the story of the Great Resignation is the story of how we balance the many and often conflicting values and priorities that call us to either stay the course or to choose another trail. How we live with that tension is as important as deciding what we do with it. How we navigate the wilderness is as important as why we left our last destination and where it is we're heading. The Great Resignation is actually the resignation that happens before we quit our jobs, before we change our affiliation, before we end a relationship. It's our acceptance of the fact that the paths we forge are shaped as much by the choices we don't make as they are by the choices that we do. The Great Resignation is about surrendering to the wilderness of life, to the moments when we can see no way and every way to where we wish to go. In a few moments, I'll talk with my guest, Dan Senor, about the wilderness of the pandemic that we are hopefully emerging from, and the many choices we now have to make as individuals, as Jews, and as members of our democracies. Done. Thank you, Dan. So beautiful. Friends, Dan Senor is the co-author of Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle, a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post bestseller. Dan has written for the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post, and is a frequent guest on CNBC's Squawk Box, CNN's Fareed Zakaria GPS, and CBS Mornings. He's also the host of the weekly podcast, Call Me Back. Previously, Dan served as a senior advisor to U.S. Senator Mitt Romney and former U.S. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan in their campaigns for national office. Under President George W. Bush, Dan was based in Baghdad for 1 year, where he served as chief spokesperson for the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq. Dan currently serves as a trustee for Startup Nation Central, a Tel Aviv-based nonprofit organization that deepens ties between Israel's innovation ecosystem and the global innovation economy. His follow-up book to Startup Nation will be published later this year. Dan lives in New York City with his wife and 2 sons. Dan and I also have a personal connection in that our mothers are dear friends, and we lived on the same street in Toronto and belonged to the same shul, Beit HaMinyan. We also both serve on the board of trustees of the Heschel School in New York City. Due to Dan's complex schedule, my interview with him was pre-recorded. I will share it with you now. It's edited very slightly for length. Give me one moment, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome to Ground Waves, Dan. Thanks for being here with our Canada and US-based audience.
Which Great makes to be with you, Dini. Thanks for having me.
Makes for an interesting first question, Dan, that I've always wanted to hear you reflect on. Your professional focus is so wide and so deep. The work you do as an investor, as an author, as a public commentator, as someone who engages with emerging trends that are shaping the Jewish world, as your connection to the realities among the geopolitical trends shaping our world, the innovation economy. I'm curious how your experience, both as someone who has lived in Canada for a good period of your life and as someone who is an American citizen, how do those experiences inform your perspectives and maybe even your values? Where do those experiences merge and where might they differ?
Yeah, I have often thought of myself as an American by birth and an American by choice. So let me say that. In that I was born in the U.S. I was born in upstate New York, as we talked about, and my family moved to Canada when I was young. So I spent a number of years in Canada, including some of my formative years. Even though while we were spending pockets of time back in the U.S., I spent a number of years living and growing up in Canada. So I had the experience of being born with American citizenship and then later in life choosing to return to the United States. And I think, so I have the perspective of like an insider in the United States, born a citizen, raised by, my father was an American soldier, fought in World War II. I have tons of American cousins and aunts and uncles. So I grew up in this American bubble. And yet I looked at America, other than summers I spent here and family time here as a kid, I looked at America from the outside. So I had that perspective of look like outside in, even though I was sort of like an insider. And I think it always made the United States seem much more exciting to me because because I was coming at it from the outside. I was excited about the sense of energy in the United States, the sense of mobility in the United States, the sense of upward mobility, the sense of opportunity, the activist mindset in the best possible ways in the United States, the idea that Americans see themselves as, when I was growing up at least, as part of a country that was not only a project, an experiment, but a country that tried to shape world events. And there was the potential to be a part of that in America. So looking from outside of America, from my perch in Canada to America, it just seemed so exceptional in the world, and certainly exceptional to what I was raised, what I thought of as in Canada growing up. However, this is not to be a criticism of Canada. I mean, the reality is culturally they're very two different places, and I've thought a lot about that. If you look at the British who left England, the ones that went to the United States had a much different mindset in terms of their role in the world and independence than the ones that went to Canada. So I think there's a legacy in both countries that we still live with today, more or less. However, as I said earlier, the mobility of America, the sense that young people could pick up and live just about anywhere they wanted in the United States. It was very common to grow up in one place, and then when you're old enough, you go live in an entirely different place, and people travel from one end of this big country to the other. And the mobility was like a feature, not a bug. And now that I have young children of my own, and I think about that, it is less of a feature, because I'm now, when you have children, as you know, I'm much more, I like want to hunker down with them. And I see the way my family in Israel is living, my sister and her children. And you have intergenerational, intense quality time spent together, literally every single weekend, every Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the norm in Israel, right? In Israel, every Shabbat is like Thanksgiving in America, right? In America, like it's common for families, multi-generational, to get together every year, but that's really it. I mean, Thanksgiving, if you're not Jewish, probably Christmas. I mean, maybe one other time during the year that the whole country experiences that. In Israel, almost everybody gets that intergenerational time together on a very regular basis, whether they're religious or secular. And I would say Canada, in this regard, Dini, is more like Israel than America. It's not to say it's like Israel, it's not. But most people I know in Canada don't pick up and move from where they were raised. Most people, of course, there are exceptions, but by and large, almost every one of the people I grew up with in Canada live almost in the same neighborhoods that they grew up in. And they spend immense and intense and frequent time with their parents and their grandparents. And they get more of that intergenerational experience and multi-generational experience than many of my peers do here in the United States with their parents and grandparents or their children, depending on how old they are. And so the mobility that I was like in awe of, and I still am in awe of, because I think it speaks to the energy of this country. As a parent, I do have a lot of admiration for the sense of rootedness and the real sense of local community that I think is pretty unique in Canada. It's not the only place in the world outside of Israel, but like I said, it's certainly in that regard more like the U.S. than more like Israel than is the U.S. Now there are parts of the United States that are like that, but I'm just struck in Canada, it's much more the norm.
Mm. That's a really interesting answer to my question. It actually leads really nicely into the next thing I wanted to ask you to comment on, which is something that I think is challenging our notion of family and tradition across the border. Dan, in your podcast last May with Joel Kotkin, your podcast called Call Me Back, which uses history to help us understand where we are in the world today and what's happening around us. In your conversation with him, you noted how, on the one hand, declining levels of engagement with organized religion pre-pandemic have experienced a dramatic bump, with more and more people seeking spiritual sustenance and religious connection during the last 2 very frightening years. On the other hand, the way people are seeking it, virtual services, online classes, theme-focused programs through the arts or nature, grazing in different online spaces where you can go to 4 shuls on a single Shabbat morning and pay nothing, if anything. Comparing that to traditional shul memberships, all of these trends are signaling that post-pandemic, Jewish life is not going to go back to the way we once knew it. And maybe that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. So as communities across the Jewish landscape are wrestling with the disruption caused by the pandemic, the disruption of increased participation, as well as the disruption of these challenges to what we once thought of as the norms about how people engage Jewishly, as we try to harness that energy as people continue to seek connection and meaning. What do you think are the highest stakes in this drama? Are they the sustainability of our Jewish institutions, absent ongoing paid membership structures? Is it the challenge of these new forms of Jewish engagement? Is it the ability or the willingness of Jewish leaders to adapt to these new realities? Something else? What's on your mind there?
It's an issue I care deeply about and spent a lot of time thinking about it. And Joel was a terrific guest on the podcast, and I commend to your listeners a piece he wrote for Quillette where he gets into this. And someone just sent me another piece that was just published by Mosaic along similar lines. That is by Daniel Johnson, who actually may have on the podcast, revisiting this exact issue. I'd say a few things. I think about the issue a little differently than when I first approached it with my conversation with Joel Kotkin. In this sense, I think we're also obsessed with Jewish institutions because they've served us all so well. I mean, you and I are both involved with a Jewish day school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which has really become for my family at least, the center of our Jewish communal life, and it's like the anchor. We're involved with the synagogue also on the Upper West Side, Ramamu, which also has a wonderful community, and obviously we know each other way back in Toronto from Beit Minyan, this terrific community and shul that really was with me and my family during our most difficult times in life, and was a great source of comfort and love and friendship for my mother and our family. So I think a lot about these institutions, but the way I think I've been analyzing it the wrong way is that these institutions are important, but they're not important in and of themselves. What I mean by that is that institutions, Jewish institutions, day schools, synagogues, whatever, should be in service of communities, not the other way around. We shouldn't wake up every day saying, oh my gosh, how are these institutions going to survive? As though that's the only question. I think the more disconcerting question we have to wrestle with is the deteriorating communal life and the desire for communal life. Because if there's a thirst for communal life, the institutions will survive, right? The institutions are products of communities. So I think what you are raising is a very practical issue that COVID has revealed, but I'm now also worried about something bigger and broader, which is if you look at the data, which we're doing a lot of research on. My co-author for our next book, Saul Singer, and I work on another book, and we're looking at some of the trends, social data trends. There's social trends in the West, which Israel has eluded, interestingly. And when you look at everything from deaths of despair, when you look at which are on the rise, like shocking, or pre-COVID, by the way, it's gotten worse during COVID, but pre-COVID, deaths from alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide, it's just skyrocketing. When you look at life expectancy coming down, way down. When you look at fertility rates coming way down, people are having fewer and fewer children. When you look at teen suicide, way up, and again, way up before the pandemic, and is even worse now during the pandemic and since the kind of last phase of the pandemic. And I can go on and on and on, right? All these trends are heading in the wrong direction in the United States. I assume Canada's not far behind. I certainly know the UK is a problem. And so what does this represent? Does this represent a breakdown in community, or does it represent a breakdown that cries out for community? Whatever it may be, I think we have to figure out how we make the desire for community and being part of communal life as so important to societal health at a macro level, and so important to family health and individual health, mental health and physical health. And if you recognize that communities is an essential input for the health of yourself, of your family, of your society, then the logical place to go are community organizations, whatever they may be, including all the ones that you described and all the permutations and variations they may take. And then the question is, will they be viable? But I'm less concerned right now about their viability. Not to say it's not a concern. I'm more concerned, like, what's going on? Like, why is there this total breakdown and this almost atomization of American life that is leading to this breakdown in communities. So then I ask, and I can go on and on about this, so feel free to cut me off. And then I ask, so why aren't people desiring it? And I had thought that it was just a lack of literacy, that you and I were raised with very to be literate Jews and very knowledgeable, more or less, about the attractiveness of a Jewish life, attractiveness of communal life, Jewish traditions. And I just think there's a whole generation of young people now being raised without any connection or, being instilled with any literacy in Judaism. And that's a big disadvantage, because if you don't have that in your core upbringing, I don't know why being part of a synagogue is going to be attractive. Like if you don't associate it with your upbringing and you don't associate it with the health, physical, mental, communal health of your upbringing, then trying to get excited about it later in life, I think, is hard. And so that already is a big threat to the institutions. And then when we make the price of admission, so to speak, so low, so then it's like, okay, so you don't really feel attached to this. And we're going to make the price for involvement, I don't mean necessarily financial price, but like the commitment of being involved, rather than having a very transient, passive engagement. Like your engagement in synagogue, as you said, you can just flip in and out of Zooms and you can just come and go. You don't really have to give anything. You don't have to give of your time if you don't want to. You don't have to give your money. You don't have to give in terms of showing up and being there and being part of it. It can just be, it's like Netflix, right? It's just, it might as well be one big streaming experience. It's on your own time. It's religion as you choose it, and no real obligation. And so I think that combination is what's scary to me, which is breakdown in communal life, lack of literacy about the attractiveness of communal life. And then to the extent that you want to engage with it, it requires no real communal involvement from participants. And that's a dangerous combination, I think, and a worrisome situation. If I wanted to take a more upbeat perspective, it would be that as we come out of the pandemic, there's going to be this intense hunger to do things in person. And as much as these kinds of conversations, virtual, got us through these last 2 awful years, it's no substitute for being with people. And I was just out to dinner last night with 10 people, and we were like in this, and we were all just spent half the dinner dazzled by how great it was to be out to dinner. Like it was like, oh my gosh, isn't this great? So I do think the Jewish world could capitalize on that, where they tell people, you know what? We're going to be Zoom free for the next month or whatever it is, or we want you here. We want you here in person, and we're not going to make it easy for you. And I think if that's done properly, I do think you'll get real engagement much more in person. But so I do think there'll be the thirst, but I am worried about the first two, the lack of understanding about why it's important and why it's so good for one's life. And and then the communal breakdowns.
Dan, I just want to push back for a second and just note how interesting it is that in your conversation on the podcast with Joel Kontkin, who's a very important commentator on these trends in the world, beyond the Jewish world as well, he spoke about how Chabad, for example, which could be described as exactly those features that you just mentioned as the most worrisome to you, are the ones that in many ways are their greatest strengths. They don't charge, they don't ask for a significant amount of commitment, and don't expect a certain level of education before throwing their arms open as widely as possible and saying, come on in, we'll take you whenever and however. And arguably they're most successful.
I'm a huge fan of Chabad.
Yeah.
I think what they have accomplished is extraordinary, and you're absolutely right. We spent a lot of time talking about Chabad. I think there are 2 models for Chabad in the Chabad world. One model is, in certain communities, Chabad is the community, right? Like that is the local synagogue. Mm-hmm. It's particularly in some like more obscure parts of, different regions and whatnot. Chabad's like the only show in town, and that is the Jewish community's community institution. That's wonderful. and to the extent it works along those terms we've described, that's great. But in other parts of the world, Chabad is a way to get people engaged with Judaism. But once they get engaged, unless they get embedded in a community, whether it's in Chabad or another Jewish institution, it's very much just like a place to show up on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, have the phone number on your cell phone of a local rabbi, but it's not much more than that. So I applaud Chabad and I celebrate Chabad, and I actually think everyone should be studying the Chabad model because I think they've been terrific. But I don't think it's applicable in every region in which it operates. I think that a diversity of vibrant Jewish institutions, from day schools to synagogues to community centers to summer camps, are really, really important to keep Jews engaged. And I don't think Chabad is the silver bullet for all of that.
Certainly not. And I agree with you. There's much to learn. Some of my most, proudest compliments that I've gotten in the work that I've done is, wow, you're like the non-Orthodox Chabad. But I hear your call for a real balance between being welcoming and also ennobling people with the dignity of responsibility, Jewish responsibility. I want to move forward because there are a couple of other things that I would love to hear your thoughts about, again, from a recent podcast that you conducted with Brett Stevens. About the prevalence of anti-Semitic incidents today, and also some of the unsettling transformations around how those incidents are being reported by the media and processed by the larger public. I have a question from the perspective of being a Jewish parent and as a Jewish professional who's concerned about identity and continuity. Remember the age-old debate about whether you need anti-Semitism as a goad to generate strong Jewish identity?
Right.
That seems to be a much less interesting conversation for young Jews today. Maybe different from the way it worked when we were growing up. Anti-Semitism does not seem to be provoking young Jews to rethink how often they go to shul or how they keep kosher, or even some of their more critical views on Israel. Ideas that it's argued are rooted in the kind of freedom and integration that they experience today. So what can we tell our children and our grandchildren about this moment of increased Jewish vulnerability? How can they integrate it into their particular Jewish experience? So
I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. My mother, I was raised very much in a home in which discussion of the Holocaust was very present a lot throughout my upbringing. And even for our children, my children, the same is true. The Holocaust is very present in our conversations. They obviously have a direct relationship with my mother, from whom they hear stories. So for them, the Shoah is a big part, for better or for worse. The Shoah is a big part of the narrative of their Jewish life. I think a lot about children who don't have that kind of direct connection to a family member. And then I think about, as we move farther and farther away from the Holocaust, the familiarity, the recency, if you will, of the Holocaust loses its impact. And it just becomes something that happened a long time ago, right? The way, I don't mean to be glib, but I'll say, we in the US, we talk about historical events that happened in the US from, many decades or centuries ago, important wars or whatnot, but it's not clear that young American kids feel a direct connection to it because it doesn't have its recency. And we're heading into that phase, I think, very soon with the Holocaust, as some of the remaining survivors actually pass. And so your question obviously is very relevant, like the fear of and yet to your point and Brett's point, anti-Semitism is on. There's no question anti-Semitic violence is on the rise. I mean, just look at the data, look at the FBI data. I mean, if you look at, we cited some of the data in that podcast. If you look at the number of hate crimes, what percentage of the American population that Jews represent, and the percentage of hate crimes reported that Jews are the victims of. I mean, it's like, here's the percentage of American Jews, and here's the percentage of hate crimes that are anti-Semitic violent attacks. So why isn't that a wake-up call for young Jews? And I think maybe one reason is that we misunderstood the impact of our children and, you know, children from a generation before us growing up with the Holocaust, the role that actually played. It was an important story for them to be familiar with, an important history. But again, back to the early part of this discussion, those were also the same kids who were also brought up in a rich communal life. So it wasn't just the story of anti-Semitism and we're a persecuted minority and we're under siege and we're cornered. It wasn't just that. It was that married with the richness and beauty and joy and coziness, if you will, bear hug of growing up in a Jewish community. So the two, I think, worked in tandem. Now you have neither. Right? You could argue we've gone through a phase we've had neither, which is anti-Semitism was declining. There was distance from the Holocaust. That wasn't part of the story. And Jewish community life, Jews were not, as we talked about, young Jews are not being in the same numbers being raised. They're unbelievably assimilated, with some exceptions, you know, unbelievably integrated into modern Western life, secular life, with no real connection to community. So the two aren't tied together. Yeah, there's anti-Semitism, but it's attacking me for what? Not for anything I'm a part of, because I'm not really a part of this. In fact, maybe it's not even attacking me. Maybe it's attacking that guy over there wearing the kippah, but so-and-so can say, well, I'm not that. I'm living my normal secular assimilated life. So I'm not the target of that. And so I think that, again, I think it's the combination. It's like anti-Semitism. So now we've got a rise in anti-Semitism. Is that going to be sufficient to motivate Jews to be engaged in their Judaism? I mean, that's all a negative, right? So it's trying to motivate them to be involved with Judaism based on a negative experience. In the past, there was the negative, the threat of the negative and the memory of the negative married to the positive. If there are so many Jews today living without the positive, and the negative is there, but they could just reason that it's not them, it's directed at other people. That's, I think, that's the risk.
An interesting thread that you've just pulled through our conversation in terms of the value and the meaning of rich intergenerational relationships rooted in robust Jewish family lives and community lives that will secure whatever the next chapter in the Jewish story is, and hopefully lead to much deeper alignment and solidarity across. The one thing that we can't deny or get away from is the increased, almost unprecedented diversity of the Jewish people. And so hopefully we'll be able to find a way to weave those threads as colorfully as, in a way that displays the manifold beauty of the different Jewish paths that are being taken today. And that's a real challenge.
Can I just add one other point? Is I find that that telling young Jews who have no real connection to Judaism to worry about anti-Semitic violence is like an abstract conversation. It's not the life they are living, right? If they're living their secular lives and they're not wearing a kippah or there's no sign of them being Jewish and they're just going about their business, living their fully assimilated lives, they don't believe they're going to be a target of anti-Semitism. So why does it bother them? And to get them scared or to get them motivated or to get them engaged is a very abstract, like why it's important. And unless people feel that that they're living Jewish life and it's not an abstract notion, whatever path of Jewish life, to your point, they're living. If they're living an experience that ties them to a history, grounds them in the present, gets them excited about the Jewish future, I think then discussions about anti-Semitism begin to really matter.
That's a really interesting and really important takeaway, Dan. I'm going to ask you one more question, if I can, to just move from the sort of internally focused conversation that we've had about the state of Jewish identity in the Jewish community today, to the way some of our values are in conversation with larger, really serious issues happening around us. When we saw each other recently, we both remarked how striking it was to see in Canada the kind of public demonstrations against vaccine mandates that we're used to seeing here in the United States. And in the time since we saw each other, that resistance has only strengthened, in causing Ottawa to declare a state of emergency a few days ago. So regardless of whether any of us personally agree or disagree, there are places where opposition to vaccines seem to come from deeply held beliefs about health or religion. But in others, resistance seems to be rooted in larger political differences, where the primary issue for someone might not be the vaccine, but actually a certain political orientation with which they identify that comes with an opposition to vaccines. So how do we understand this blending of high stakes agendas in this way? And how do we as a democracy balance public health with freedom of conscience when so many motives seem to be politically driven?
Yeah, it's a topic I have visited from time to time on my podcast, and that will continue to revisit, because I don't think we have fully absorbed the long-lasting political shocks and aftershocks of these last 2 years of COVID. The only analogy I can give is, and it's imperfect, obviously, is the 2008 global financial crisis. So after the 2008 global financial crisis, many people thought, observers, analysts, journalists, when are the political shock waves going to come from this? When is our politics going to express its frustration, its sort of crack up with it, that it's saying that this was not okay what happened, and a lot of people suffered, because it didn't seem to after the 2008 financial crisis. We just kind of went back to business. And again, this is not passing judgment or expressing support for any one political figure or class of political figures in the United States or another, but it was fairly conventional, more or less, within the kind of mainstream. Politicians got elected, and then 2016 Donald Trump gets elected, who was, shall we say, unconventional. And I think you can maybe not draw a direct line, but an indirect line from the upending that happened in 2008 and 2009, and the human suffering that happened, and the sense of unfairness about the system that resulted in, almost a decade later, a real crack up of our political system, for better, for again, like you were saying, whether you agree with it or disagree, it's not the point. It was a earthquake in our politics, and I was trying to think, like, what led up to that earthquake. And there were, look, I don't want to get into a whole, there are a number of trends you can point to in events, but I think there never having been a reckoning with that, what went wrong in the 2000 financial crisis, what led up to the 2008 financial crisis, how our elites got it completely wrong, how, our central bankers and our political leaders on both sides of the aisle didn't see it coming, told us everything would be fine, and, an economy flooded with subprime debt, subprime mortgages was totally, that we were, we could inoculate ourselves from any risks from that. I can go on and on. They all got it wrong. And there was like a revolt against the system and the establishment that I think we saw in 2016. And we also saw in 2020. So in 2020, you had almost the identical electoral outcome as you did in 2016, only slightly different. So like, instead of, Trump winning the states that went one way by less than 1%, Biden won the 3 or 4 states that went by less than 1%. And so it was still, the country was still very divided. And then you had down ballot, even though Biden won at the top of the ticket, down ballot, you had Republicans winning. So people were going to the ballot booth, voting against Trump, voting for the Republican. And you look at where some of these curious outcomes, elections happened. It was in, you had people who had voted for Obama, and then Romney, and then Trump, and then Biden. I mean, it was like people were all over the place in their voting pattern. I just think that's all a reflection of a crack up in politics. There's no predictability to it. And I think we are living through that, and we are going to be living through it for a while. I look at a lot of political data. I've seen some focus groups. When you see the data, when you listen to the discussions, there's something fundamentally not okay in the minds of many people. The public health authorities did very important work. The public health authorities also got a lot of things wrong. And the decisions that were wrong led to, for a lot of people, losing basically 2 years of their lives. For a lot of young people, extraordinary setbacks in learning, extraordinary setbacks in mental health, extraordinary increases in loneliness, and like, so there's going to be a reckoning around that. It's not about, so I think there's a tendency to say, oh, Republicans are against masks and the liberals are for it. It's deeper than that. I think there was already growing distrust of institutions before the public health, before the pandemic. I think now there's going to be a lot more. We tend to kind of roll our eyes at the politics of it and say, isn't it terrible all this got so politicized? Which is true to some degree.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the politics is an expression of immense frustration. And I do think the frustration is both in some areas warranted, and we haven't fully gotten our heads around the long-term implications of it. I think people are angry, and they are going to be angry for a while, and there's going to be a sense of I just think there was already a crisis of distrust in governing institutions, and I think that's only going to increase. And so to your question about Canada, by the way, sorry. So I use Canada as an example when I talk to people about this, because I say, look, I lived in Canada. It is like, when it comes to political activism, it is like the most passive place in the world, right? One of the things that was exciting to me about America is people were excited and engaged. And in Canada, they kind of observe events. I never got the sense that Canadians, the civic-minded culture in Canada was not to shape events. It was a much more of a passive engagement with politics. And then you see what's going on. Again, whether you agree with, to your point, whether you agree with the truckers' revolt or not, it's an extraordinary expression of organic, really organic political activism. And my point to people here is, even in Canada, this is how angry people are, that even in Canada you have this kind of revolt. So and I, like I said, I think it's not just going to wind down. If Omicron or the subvariant of Omicron, BA2, just kind of wither, I don't think the political earthquake just quietly goes away.
Well, I hope that what you're leaving us with, really drawn again right through our whole conversation, is something that can put some tools in our hands to try to address these many different trends that are going to shape our future right now. And if I hear you, Dan, I hear you calling for an openness to revisiting who we have known ourselves to be in the past, and a renegotiation of our self-understanding as Jews, as Americans, as Canadians, and to create the space for dialogue and for thinking. And in many ways, that also touches on what I imagine is one of the inspirations of the work you're doing today, particularly with your podcast, which is a very deeply Jewish expression of returning to the past, not just to remember, but to mine it for a pathway to the future, to really make our past a usable past. And in the hopes that the pandemic does become a thing of the past, let's pray that on all sides of the Canadian-American border and throughout the world, that we truly learn the lessons we need to learn and get back to living the life that we have been gifted to live. So I thank you so much, Dan, for your time. Wish you continued success in your work, and I look forward to learning from you and with you in the many years ahead.
Great, Dini. Thanks for hosting me. It was a great conversation. Hopefully we can do it again. Until then, hope to see you soon in person.
Thanks, Dan. Freedom is a word we hear very often today. Freedom of thought is being used to justify preventing teachers from teaching students about things their parents find objectionable, even if historically true. Health freedom is a term being used to advocate for eliminating mask and vaccination mandates. But what exactly does freedom mean? Does it mean, as it seems to in our day, the freedom to do whatever you want? Is every freedom equal, even one that is suffused with bias or puts people in mortal danger? In the Jewish tradition, we have different words for freedom. One, which inspired the inscription on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, is the Hebrew word dror, which comes from the Torah's mandate for the Jubilee year and refers to the release of slaves, the cancellation of debt, and the return of land to its original tribal owners. In the Talmud, the word dror is defined as cherut, which is defined as physical freedom, to live where you want, as you want, undominated. But the medieval commentator Rabbeinu Bachya pointed out that dror, or freedom in this sense, is essentially a return to the status quo. Slaves revert to being free people as they were before they were sold into slavery, and land is returned to its original divinely ordained tribal owners before it was ever sold to another. This is backward-looking freedom, a return to the way things were. While there are deep messages embedded in the Torah's vision of dror, such as the inviolable freedom of every single human being, and the idea that no person can claim to own any part of the earth, we know that going back to the way things were is rarely possible or even desirable. So what would forward-looking freedom mean? A freedom that carries us toward how things might yet be. Jewish wisdom suggests that it would be a freedom that imagines that the world we continue to work for will be predicated not on mutually exclusive rights, but rather on collective and collaborative rights. A freedom that balances individual liberty with societal well-being. One that makes room for a diversity of beliefs without suggesting that all beliefs must be held as necessarily equal. One that makes room for multiple stories without silencing the voices of those whose stories are not your own. As we negotiate the ongoing pulls within our own personal lives, between our often clashing needs and desires, and as we witness in the United States and Canada, in Israel and around the world, a battle for freedoms that ironically and dangerously, if gained, would only limit the liberty of others, we yearn now for shalom, for peace, a forward-looking peace that will lead us into a more hopeful and more harmonious future. The very word shalom contains within it the freedom we seek. For shalom comes from the word shlemut, or wholeness, not a state of peace wherein we've vanquished debate, but a peace wherein we've learned to hold all the pieces of ourselves, of our communities, of our societies in one encompassing embrace. We yearn to build cities and societies modeled by our dreams for Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, the city of wholeness, whose Torah is meant to permeate the entire world, not a city where miraculously there's no conflict. We know that's a fantasy, but one which is strong enough, humble enough, brave enough to hold, to contain all its inhabitants, all its traditions, all its stories. Yerushalayim habnuya ke'ir shechubra la yachdav. Jerusalem built up, a city knit together. Before we close our Groundwaves program, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoyed. I invite you to join us again for our next Groundwaves, which will take place on the night of March 15th. Watch out for details about our next guest. In the meantime, you can listen to over a year's worth of Groundwaves programs on Spotify to enjoy more of Dan's incredible music and my conversations with artists, scientists, politicians, activists, and many, many more. On February 23rd, we'll gather for our next everyday ethics class on shopping in the digital age. Is it ethical to take up a salesperson's time trying things on and then going and buying it online? How can we approach this new reality of the digital age, not so new anymore, informed by our Jewish values? Join us at 7:30 p.m. on February 23rd. You can register on the Shaarei Zion Beth-El website. I look forward to being in Montreal with the community on the Shabbat of March 11th and 12th. I'm excited to see you all again and be together for a beautiful Shabbat. We always close Ground Waves with a kavanah, with an intention. The melody that Dan has been playing tonight is one to which the words from Tehillim are set. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yemini. Tidbak lashoni lechiki im lo eskerechi. Im lo a'aleh et Yerushalayim al rosh simchati. If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I remember you not. If I set not Yerushalayim, Yerushalem, above my greatest joy. These words call to mind the destruction of ancient Jerusalem, whose promise to be a beacon of wholeness, of justice, and of peace we relentlessly continue to strive to fulfill through the potential embedded within her amazing rebirth. We close tonight's Ground Waves program by singing these words to remind us of the global reach of Yerushalayim's promise, to remind us of the commitments to love and to unity that we must each make and fulfill between families, communities, faiths, nations, between us and all of creation and our planet, and between us and the source of life. Im ashkachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yemini, tidbak shoni lechikim lo ezkerechi im lo a'aleh im lo a'aleh et Yerushalayim al rosh simchati al rosh simchati. Laila Tov, everyone. Good night. Stay safe and healthy. We'll see you again soon.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Thank you.